Welcome back for episode 17 of the Astronomical Apocrypha, the Seleukid Empire narrative let's play for Rome II with Divide et Impera. Last time, Antiochos Soter made huge investments into his imperial infrastructure, devoting time and money to building improvements from Illyria to Armenia, hiring a new imperial satrap of Arabia Felix, a new clandestine agent in Caucasia, and extensive military training and reforms. Antiochos Theos was joined in the bacchanalian atmosphere of his Illyrian camp by the famous Macedonian athlete Antiochos, while Euclid was disappointed by his shield-bearer Damon, who was defeated in single combat by the Cimmerian Conon. Across the breadth of the Caucasus, Euclid and the wisdom of the goose captured Phasis under the watching eyes of a nearby Scythian fleet. With the Seleukid pinchers closing on either side and Sardis advancing from the south, Caucasia was wrested from the Bosphorian kings in its entirety by Euclid's unrelenting advance, severing the Cimmerians from their Median conquests. The old emperor presses east like a man possessed, now only the mysterious and dangerous Taksashila standing between Antiochos and the land of his mother's people. But a half-world away, indolence and reverie may give way to a far greater threat to the ruling Seleukid dynasty.
My friend, you must let me treat you to another cask of Illyrian wine. I find it to be completely necessary to warm the spirit in this weather. Boreas himself is blowing the snows down from the mountains. Sadly, I do not possess your godlike constitution for wine. You said we were going to meet your woman at the port. I didn't know Laodike was arriving from Egypt. Not Laodike. That shrew is off in Syria with my useless sons. Greetings, Antiochos, my old friend from the Olympic Games. Welcome to our humble camp here in Illyria. Your presence will be invaluable in training and entertaining the men. So, where is she? Getting into her furs aboard the ship. She'll be along shortly. Something else to warm your spirit in the weather, God King. You still have a mortal weakness, I see. Nonsense. Like Zeus, I have big appetites when it comes to the fairer sex. Tell them to get a fire blazing in the hearth and start the wine flowing. Tonight we celebrate.
I spent a little while at the outset of this episode perusing Rome II's somewhat cryptic-looking political tabs to get a sense of the state of the empire from an inside perspective. Our Imperium level hovers at the upper end of 6, which has exclusively negative modifiers, which I suppose is a mechanic to modulate the game difficulty as the empire swells. The influence of court nobles on governance might give the impression that we're living in some sort of a republic, and perhaps this impression is a comforting thought to the democracy-loving Hellenistic peoples within it. But rest assured, the whole thing is quite autocratic, with Antiochos Soter running the show in the east, and Antiochos Theos keeping watch over the west. The other men with significant power in the empire, in addition to the two co-regents, who command about 2,000 influence combined, are Antiochos Soter's longtime right-hand man Euclid, who has nearly 500, and the heads of the other noble families, Cordelian commanding over 1,000 influence by himself, and Diogenes, who roughly counterbalances Euclid with about 500 influence of his own. It's worth noting that the death of one or more of these influential characters could have a severely destabilizing effect on the political situation. As Diogenes makes his preparations for assault upon Mascat, he's almost upstaged by another of our enterprising satrapies, Drangiana, who have dispatched a small fleet to make an attack, and perhaps trying to claim the city for themselves. Diogenes is having none of it, however, and refuses to support the Drangiana in their bid for a bit of territory on the Arabian Peninsula, and their fleet is easily repelled by the Saba garrison. Perhaps misinterpreting Diogenes' inaction as hesitation or mercy, the Saba try once again for a peace deal although this of course is not going to happen. The Saba army defending the city has now disappeared and has been replaced by a Hagar force. The Hagar are not interested in participating in the battle, so Diogenes has a huge advantage on the balance bar with his well-equipped and experienced soldiers up against a large but poorly trained garrison. However, with the expected losses in the 30 to 40% range, I decide this battle might be one worth fighting. Diogenes knows he can once again use his missile superiority to hammer the defenders and soften them up unless they come out to meet him. So I simply set up a long line of pikes and spears with the Lithobolos just behind in the center, and Ethiopian archers ready to move out in front with their deadly bows. I have a pair of royal peltast regiments off to the right, who should prove deadly against the Saba spear infantry, and the valuable but weak camel baggage train remains in the rear. The first shots of the Lithobolos cast into the city center rouse the Arabian horse skirmishers from within, and as they gallop to the edge of town, the Ethiopian archers draw back their bowstrings and let loose with a flurry of arrows that fell a couple of the Arabian horses. The horsemen temporarily retreat, and then the two regiments split up, one heading east and the other west, as the first of the Saba infantry file out toward the edge of town. I send my tough hoplites in to drive back the Arabian horsemen on the right, while the group on the left make a brief sally against my own Arabian spear levies there, finding little success. The Arabians advance under a barrage of Ethiopian arrows, and as their garrison captain leads his men into the two phalanges at the center of my line, the third on the left repositions their regiment to envelop the western side of the Saba column, while the royal peltasts and the hoplites close in from the eastern side. One spear levy regiment is dispatched to hunt down the Arabian horse skirmishers while the other guards the flank of the phalanx. Diogenes, not wanting to miss all of the action, brings his own retinue and accompanying Greek cavalry regiments around the eastern side to look for an opening. The precursor javelins of the peltasts precede a fearsome charge, and several of the Arabian skirmishers are driven backward, west, into the waiting levy spears there, although those with the courage to stay are swiftly cut down by the royal peltasts. Even as the elite infantry bite into the Saba flank, their frontal charge is also going poorly as the garrison spearmen struggle to find a gap in the phalanx. Really, the only units we've lost any men from at this point are the Arabian levies, and Diogenes by this point brings his retinue into the chaos in the enemy midst, and the sight of the notorious Seleukid general's retinue of companions sends a shudder of fear through their enemy, the entire force wavering by this point. Diogenes barely has any time to give a cry of triumph and cut down a couple of the fleeing Saba soldiers before the morale of their entire force evaporates inside the deadly Seleukid semicircle. I was a little bit surprised to see the battle had not yet ended, but then I spotted the lone Saba missile regiment on the eastern edge of the battle. I send my skirmish cavalry off to deliver the news that they've lost the battle, and after a volley of javelins for my horsemen, they seem to get the message. We took much lower but still substantial numerical losses of 10% compared to 30 to 40% predicted in this battle, but as noted, these were almost exclusively suffered by the Arabian levies, and as I'm sure you can guess, Diogenes puts little value on Greek lives and even less on those of his Arabian levies. There are several options for this settlement, ranging from the subjugation of the Saba to liberation of a nascent faction as a Seleukid ally, but I want to unify Arabia Felix under Seleukid rule, so I raze the town and resettle a mixture of its former occupants and some Greeks in a nearby Hellenic colony, repairing the ruins of the lead-producing infrastructure in the local jetty, and replacing the other eastern apparatus with Seleukid homestead and quarry buildings. Alcandre scouts the Taksashila presence at Sardrakaria and Suzia, finding both locations poorly defended. The dragons of Bel Marduk are still replenishing, however, and are not ready to head eastward, and Euclid and his men are still traveling south from Armenia to rendezvous with Antiochos. My income is fair but still a bit low, and to recoup some of the upkeep from armies that are sitting idle, I disband Antigonus Dozen's men of the Sons of the Cyclops, leaving only the puppet king of Macedonia himself to govern the city of Pella. Next turn, we finished research on temple design, allowing access to some of the Tier 4 settlement and temple constructions. More interestingly, we have another event. Antiochos Theos, the now legendary if indolent co-regent of the Western Seleukid Empire, has apparently been having a dalliance with a flirtatious woman who has followed him all the way from Egypt, Berenike, the daughter of the late King Ptolemy II Philadelphos. And now he's decided, against all good judgment, to put aside his wife and cousin Laodike in favor of the new woman. It's costly, but in the interest of the story, we'll allow it to go forward. This necessarily displaces Laodike and potentially puts the inheritance of her sons into great jeopardy. As for our research focus, I switched gears from the civic technology tree back to military to strike a balance. In general, I've avoided going down the siege branch because the technologies do not seem all that useful, and have avoided the cavalry branch to an even greater degree because many of the technologies have upkeep cost penalties associated with them. However, I do still want to reach the ultimate technology in the management tree, elephant trading, so I go ahead and pick up the prerequisite supply reforms, which has some nice benefits in terms of increased recruitment capacity and decreased cost. Still just north of Antiochos Soter's position at Ecbatana, Euclid pauses for one more season, time to recruit a Lithobolos siege engine into the ranks of his army, and Antiochos Soter likewise keeps his position at Ecbatana to replenish his army. Diogenes packs his camel baggage train and once again sets off on the dusty desert road, this time heading north toward the eponymous settlement of Hagar at the eastern coastal edge of Arabia Magna, and leaving behind the busy endeavors underway at the Greek colony at Mascat. Poor Anastasia, whose talents as a brothel worker have gone completely underutilized, continues a frigid northern expedition, embarking on a lengthy journey on a rickety transport through the mists of the Caspian Sea. Alcandre, meanwhile, uncovers the first hint of the Taksashila military at Artakuana. During the intern phase, the Hagar withdraw their army before the might of the Golden Fleece, back into their home territory, the way now apparently open to Diogenes and his men for a fresh conquest in Arabia Magna. Unfortunately, a messenger, breathless and wide-eyed, brings the news to Diogenes of the fall of his colony at Mascat to an extant Saba force who hid in the desert and returned to wreak vengeance on the Greeks. Next turn, with his army now prepared, Antiochos Soter rides out of Ecbatana into eastern Media and swiftly captures Raga from the Taksashila occupants. For whatever reason, I noticed Antiochos' prized emerald lens was temporarily lost during this engagement, and I select another ancillary to take its place. The dragons of Bel Marduk are followed shortly by Euclid and his Wisdom of the Goose, who march into the northern parts of Media. As Diogenes approaches Mascat, it seems that the Saba, rather than reclaiming their own city, have instead killed the Greeks and then incited the local tribe to take control of the settlement. A bizarre turn of events, now leaving Diogenes to contend with the armies of two factions rather than one. Anastasia continues sailing across the freezing waters of the Caspian Sea, finally glimpsing the cliffs along its eastern coastline toward the end of winter. Running quickly through the event log before proceeding, we see that the conflict between Rome and the Insubris has come to blows. The Armenian population is up in arms, and Antiochos Soter has, much to his relief, recovered the coveted emerald lands. Artakuana now deserted of military presence, Alcandre backtracks towards Suzia, making slow progress at the edge of the desert but finding no enemy presence there either. Finally, our third but original spy, Eurydice, continues her circumferential journey around the Mediterranean, finding Rome in command of a gigantic chunk of Africa, having displaced the Carthaginians to a great degree. Antiochos Soter peers through his emerald lens, consults the astrologer, and finds Sadracaria to be a suitable next target, marching through the Alborz Mountains to the north, his prized Syrian war elephants making the journey intact due to the low valley and temperate climate, but the slow progress leaving the dragons just short of their destination. Euclid then takes up the governance of Media Magna, his army patrolling the border and taking up the Hellenic construction and conversion at Raga. Diogenes, bringing his army to bear against the Saba, finds himself drawn in further than he would like, the Saba deviously retreating to the reinforcement range of the rematerialized Mascat faction. I'm faced with a similar dilemma here. Utilize my veteran commander's night assault ability to enable an easy victory against one army, and then strike out at the other fortified garrison next turn, or to draw the garrison out into the field in broad daylight in a more challenging battle requiring manual maneuvering but killing two birds with one stone. Diogenes, ever the Stoic, chooses the more difficult but rewarding path, setting up his Lithobolos and pikemen and inviting his enemies to come and get him. We're fighting on a moderate grade that slopes downward to the left, and as you might expect, I try to take advantage of as much of the high ground as I can, deploying my men at the far right-hand side of the deployment zone angled toward the Saba army, who are already deployed in full view in front of us. I'm setting up a three-sided box of sorts to try to draw the enemy in while protecting the flank of my vulnerable Lithobolos crew from any enterprising enemy cavalry. The Mascat enter the battlefield from the southeastern side, from the direction of the city which we so recently occupied. The Saba army is moving toward our line, essentially straight up the slope, and as they begin closing in, the archers start to let loose with their arrows. The Lithobolos also eventually adds its missiles to the barrage, although it has a little trouble finding the targeting or the range or something. The first clash begins between our expendable Arabian levies and a unit of Arabian light camel cavalry at the right edge of the line, and the camels, ill-equipped as they are to fight uphill against a spear brigade, are just as tempting for my nearby royal peltasts who have again taken up a position on the right flank of our enemy. The Arabian levies find themselves to be unusually competent today and up to the task of repelling the enemy cavalry, and so they push further into the enemy midst, engaging the leading Saba spear regiment there, as Diogenes and the cavalry lead a flanking maneuver on the right, followed by the royal peltasts. On the left-hand side, the remaining regiment of Agirios' African elephants head straight for the vulnerable Arabian skirmishers on the Saba's northern flank. Diogenes is threatened by the enemy general Molnaquin's bodyguard of Hurasunan Tosida heavy spear infantry, and so withdraws his cavalry, although the royal peltasts continue undaunted, wickedly effective from both a short distance and in melee. The enthusiasm of the Arabian levies has caused the engagement to take place a little bit further forward than I had planned, and this leaves the Phalangitai watching from the rear instead of battling up front, so they too begin their march down the slope with sarissas leveled. Diogenes slams into the mounted and unmounted skirmishers at the enemy rear, as much of their force begins to flee. Though the Saba general is not yet contained, the situation is mostly under control, and I'm beginning to become more concerned with the oncoming multitude of the Mascat garrison, pulling back the spears and pikes into an orderly line, while Molnaquin finds himself isolated and comes under assault from all sides as Diogenes and the cavalry run roughshod over his weakened retinue. With the Saba now all but defeated and their general's corpse rolling down the slope, all that remains is a relatively straightforward fight against the large but ill-equipped Mascat garrison. Their northern flank is composed mostly of archers and armed townsfolk, a very soft target for the elephants who are sent around that flank to inflict some terror on their northern wing. The rest of the battle is simply our pikes and spears against theirs in a head-on engagement. Greek heavy spear infantry against more numerous lightly armored Easterners, a battle that has been fought for hundreds of years, and now as before the Greek armor and discipline is demonstrating its superiority. We again lose more than a few of our Arabian levies in the process, but as one Mascat regiment after another falls back before the hoplites and the phalanx, Diogenes judges the moment as ripe for the killing blow and rides in among the enemy rear and the archer regiments with his cavalry. This causes an avalanche of Seleukid advantage on the balance bar, although the rout takes time to develop as the enemy are so numerous. Eventually, with essentially all of the Mascat in flight except for their general, the Sabaean nobles among his retinue watch in horror as Diogenes and his cavalry hunt down their fleeing comrades with cold brutality. Diogenes waits for his royal peltasts to engage Teratikos' regiment in melee before ramming his heteroi lances into the rear of the Mascat general's retinue, very quickly precipitating a complete rout. We again lost mostly Arabian levies in the attack, although in a bit of a surprise, Diogenes' retinue suffered about a third of its number in casualties. Initially, it wasn't completely clear to me how this happened, but looking back, it seems as if Diogenes turned his back on the Mascat general's retinue while pursuing their archers and received a couple of missile volleys in the back. With the Saba and their Mascat reinforcements now dispatched, those remaining at Mascat fall to Diogenes' swift follow-up attack with barely any resistance whatsoever. The biggest disappointment in all of this to Diogenes is that the time and money invested in the Hellenic infrastructure at Mascat is now lost, and he's forced to start over with his plans for the Greek colony there. Up north in the frozen Caucasus Mountains, we maintain an uneasy peace with the Scythians, who have moved up a relatively large army at the narrow mountain pass north of Phasis, prompting Euclid to fortify his men at the opposite end of the pass, in case of any organized push south when the ice thaws in the spring. As Antiochos Soter patiently waits for the winter to pass in order to conduct an assault on the next Taksashila settlement at Sadrakarta, he's unpleasantly surprised to be attacked by the Taksashila Lord Tiglath-Pileser, riding an enormous armored Indian war-elephant at the head of a huge full-stack army, and he's reinforced even by the local garrison. Antiochos swiftly retreats to the south, out of range of the town garrison, but he's still caught by Tiglath-Pileser, who forces a confrontation. He has a fairly interesting army with several units I hadn't seen before, including the general's war elephants who are roughly equivalent to our own Syrian war elephants, several units of light Indian axe infantry, mace-wielding heavy infantry, and assortment of bows, spears, and light cavalry. The balance bar says we'll lose, although I would hope that Antiochos and his army, though mostly composed of middle-tier units, would be able to put up a fierce resistance. In the far distance to the north is the coast of the Caspian Sea, although it's too far away to figure into this battle, and before it the ground has a severe slope into the low coastal plain. This too is unlikely to be a factor, since even though the low ground is at the extreme northern end of the map, it's at the back of the Taksashila deployment zone. I do have a very mild slope to take advantage of, and not knowing what to expect of this Indian army, I arrange my men in a tight standard formation. The Taksashila emerge from the trees in their deployment zone, angling their line slightly as they march up the slope toward our army. My Lithobolos gets a few enfilade shots in at their approaching regiments as they present the short side of their facing to the stone thrower. The Greek archers shower the oncoming light Iranian skirmishers with their arrows, and then begin pulling back to the safety of our line, as my hoplites also wheel slightly backward to cover our flanks. So far, the battle has gotten off to a reasonably positive start, as we've inflicted some damage and taken little in return, and I get another stroke of good luck as the Iranian light cavalry, in unrelenting pursuit of our archers, run smack into the points of a white shield phalanx. Seeing his men holding their ground, Antiochos brings his powerful cavalry squadron around the right-hand wing of the enemy advance, and there he's able to charge directly in against the unarmored Indian axemen, although his charge in turn draws a single unit of spear infantry, so I pull back, although we've inflicted a substantial charge already. Meanwhile, the main infantry engagement is getting underway, and my white shield pikes, particularly the central unit, are under tremendous strain as multiple units try to hack their way through the phalanx. The macemen in particular are a serious threat, heavily armed and armored as they are. Though I didn't know it at the time, their mace is one of the few weapons in the game with armor-piercing damage. My citizen cavalry suffered much more than I expected for their swift attack on the Indian axemen, 2 units losing about a quarter of their men each. Antiochos and these cavalrymen bring their horses further around the enemy rear to angle for a strike on the archers there, as Tiglath-Pileser and his war elephants are now charging in toward the main fight, sure to inflict terrible casualties on either side. My own Syrian elephants have gotten embroiled among the Indian axemen on the right flank and gone berserk in the process, so I'm mostly interested in disentangling Antiochos and the cavalry from this engagement. At this point, my cavalry split up, one regiment chasing down the archers to the west, another charging straight in to attack Tiglath-Pileser's elephants from the rear, and another attempting to outmaneuver the enemy spearmen and keep them away from my elephants, and failing to some degree. Antiochos adds his own retinue to the growing melee on the right side of our line, both generals and their mounts now embroiled in a furious fight for control of the battle. My 2nd regiment of Syrian war elephants move in on the western flank, and I decide that I have no choice but to commit the uncontrollable animals to the fight, aware of the possibility of damage to my own men and to the elephants themselves from the nearby spear infantry, but increasingly apprehensive of Tiglath-Pileser's presence on the front lines. Antiochos fires off his multitude of abilities, seeking to gain the upper hand. While I'm able to start slowly grinding down some of the Indian infantry regiments, I seem to be barely scratching the armored elephants of the Indian general's elite bodyguard. On the positive side, my own elephants seem to be every bit as unstoppable, steamrolling the Indian regiments on either side of their army with very little damage to themselves. On balance, we're winning the battle, but then just as I'm sure we've reached the cusp of victory with numerous enemy regiments wavering, something quite unnerving happens.
These Indian maces will smash your helmet just as easily as your skull, and a shield is of no use against an elephant. Your only defense is the wall of Sarissa lances, so pull together and bring your spears to bear. Look, the king is alone. Where are his royal companions? Soldiers, push forward, hard. Antiochos, king, look behind you. Not enough time to reach him. Give me your spear, loyal hoplite. I will cast it into the belly of the beast. Run, Antiochos, the empire depends on your safety. We will fell Tiglath and his elephant cataphracts. Come on, brothers. If you cannot fell the elephants, drag their riders from the saddle and impale them.
Antiochos' own companion cavalry retinue, diminished to perhaps a quarter of its original number, breaks before the terror of the Indian elephant cataphracts, and the men are lucky to rescue their commander before he's trampled by the berserk beasts. Adding my elephants and free cavalry into the central engagement is sufficient to rout the enemy infantry there. Although by the time they've gone, all of my infantry regiments have suffered heavy casualties. Even with his army now in full retreat, Tiglath-Pileser continues fighting on whether he wants to or not, his elephants now running amok and completely unbreakable. What I did here is probably not advised, but ordering all of my available infantry in, I attempted to bring down the rampaging elephants in melee. The Indian war elephants continue smashing through the ranks of my men, completely oblivious to pain or casualties. Slowly but eventually the retinue is brought down to just the enemy general himself and his mount, and the lone elephant, evidently regaining its senses, begins to retreat. We're given the victory at this point, but I continue the battle to ensure the demise of the enemy commander, and this proves even more difficult than I had envisioned, my men practically hanging off the elephant as it drags them toward the edge of the battle. Over a minute of this charade goes on before the great beast is finally hamstrung, its rider pulled from the saddle, and unceremoniously disposed of. A close victory and a near miss for our faction leader, who was almost killed in action. Fortunately, no other Indian armies emerge, and so Antiochos seems to have escaped the situation for now. With the Taksashila army the more severely weakened, Antiochos is able to catch up to their army in order to further damage their already weakened force. They would ordinarily be reinforced by the garrison, but I decide to simply destroy the remnant of the purifying flames in a night assault. Euclid has the movement to reach Antiochos with his own army, satisfactorily close for the defensive reinforcement, but not for an attack on the city this turn. Turning my attention to other matters for the moment, we have an increasing public order problem at Armavir, such that a revolt is bound to occur very soon if nothing is done. I was moving Olympias in to govern the region, but she'll not arrive soon enough, nor will her presence alone be sufficient to avert the crisis, so I raise another army at Armavir, nominating Sophocles as the new general. He has the perfect, calm demeanor that is needed in such a situation, but his wife, an alcoholic, is greatly undermining his presence with her -3 penalty to authority. While normally I would leave the alcohol consumption of a man's wife out of the matters of state, under the circumstances I'm willing to go to extreme measures to rid the faction of this woman. Sophocles' wife is both deep in her cups and deeply entrenched in the other noble houses, and I'm unable to order their divorce unless she's in Antiochos' house, so I spend the necessary money to bribe the man over to the royal family, and then issue the divorce order. This has gotten Sophocles back his authority level, although Armavir is still under imminent, if not immediate, threat of revolt. Before I end the turn, I also temporarily disband Antigonus Dozen's retinue, and this was merely a cost-saving measure, changing out the expensive heteroi for a cheaper infantry retinue. The Arsoi, our liberated friends from the Ponto-Caspia area, are very keen to establish trade with the expansive Seleukid kingdom, and they're willing to pay handsomely for it as well. Ever greedy, I ask for more money, and they refuse, potentially a big missed opportunity, but we'll invite them back to the bargaining table next turn. The Shadow of Helios, having marched into Rhodes' colony in central Arabia, find themselves called in to assist in the defense of our allies' settlement against the Hagar. It's quite fortunate for them that we were nearby, as it seems their settlement would not stand much of a chance against the Arabian armies. I could have allowed their settlement to fall, although I'm more interested in weakening the Hagar, who have long plagued our territories in this region. Antiochos Soter once again finds himself being upstaged by a satrapy, as Persis move in a large army to take Sadracaria from the Taksashila. I'm not interested in helping them and secretly hope they'll fail, but they turn out to be up to the task and snatch the settlement right out from under us. As promised, I return Antigonus Dozen to his post as satrap of Macedonia, substituting some of the weak Doryphoroi spearmen for his expensive heteroi retinue. It's costly to begin with, but we'll have recouped that money in a few turns. I also remember to return to the diplomatic tab to re-engage the Arsoi in trade talks, and I'm not disappointed getting a large sum of 8,000 talents for our trouble, most of this money in turn being spent on settlement upgrades at Caucasia. Diogenes, ever ranging up and down the roads of Arabia, once again heads off toward the Hagar capital, moving slowly with his camel baggage train. Although we can't capture Sadracarta this turn, I'm at least afforded the opportunity to replenish in our satrapy's territory, so Euclid and Antiochos Soter continue moving east toward the remainder of the Taksashila-held territories. Ahead of their expedition, Alcandre continues their scouting, uncovering even more Indian forces at Pirata and Alexandria Arachosia. Having moved up to the edge of Yathrib, bordering on the Hagar's territory and shadowed by two of formerly defeated armies, Eugenios surprisingly finds himself under attack as the Hagar suddenly move in unison against the Shadow of Helios. However, even though our army is quite weakened, they're still easily able to best the diminished Arabian armies. I'm not sure why the Hagar did this, but I decide to take the gift, driving their armies off. The Saba too present us with a suicidal assault, sending their tiny fleet already battered in the Persian Gulf by Drangiana against Maskat, the garrison this time able to repel the attackers. Though we were bound to suffer a revolt at Armenia, the Eleusinian mysteries have arrived just in time, and spellbound as they are by the Greek mysticism, the masses in Armenia are pacified and no rebellion occurs. Two more key military reforms are also completed this turn. Those of the Parthians, a tribe east of the Caspian Sea who are not the least bit friendly toward us, as well as the Marian reforms of Rome, ushering in the professional soldier class, the basic element of a potentially unstoppable Roman war machine. We'll have to keep a close eye on both of these factions going forward. Anastasia is just now moving south through Parthian territory, uncovering their settlements and noting their military strength as she goes. Down in Arabia, Diogenes continues to close in on the Hagar, reaching the border with Mascat, but staying in our own territory for now, just as the shadow of Helios remain at the edge of Yathrib to replenish their numbers, and Antiochos Soter remains in Persian-held Sadrakarta. Next turn, Diogenes finally makes his move against the last Arabian-held settlement in Arabia, bringing the Golden Fleece to the walls of Hagar. They have a very strong garrison, and the odds are stacked against us in this fight. Though I could attack this turn, I'll give Diogenes a few more turns to construct some additional siege equipment, and hopefully that will diminish the enemy advantage. With the wealth surplus this turn, I continue my settlement upgrades at Caucasia, now adding another tier to Phasis as well. Although Antiochos Soter hasn't completely replenished his force, I decide to go ahead and venture further into Taksashila territory, with Euclid leading the way, as I don't want Persia to continue capturing lands to the east. The Taksashila, seeing Antiochos' continued aggression into their land, ask again for peace, but no quarter is given. Next turn, Cordelian's sub-faction tries to lure Sophocles away from the royal family, and though it's expensive, I decide to pay to keep him under our control. I don't want any arranged marriages with drunk women, with Armenia still hanging in the balance. Diogenes keeps up his siege at the walls of Hagar, who have not yet sallied out to oppose him, and Eugenios begins making his way through the desert to the east, in case Diogenes needs his assistance. Irritatingly, in spite of my concerted effort to prevent this from happening, Persia have continued their opportunistic conquest against the Taksashila, again capturing territory ahead of Antiochos Soter at Suzia. This will make our domination of them easier, but I'm starting to become concerned about Persia's size. In addition to the active involvement of Persia, the growth of the Seleukid Empire has been slowed to a degree by similarly frustrating events, such as a resurgent Mascat faction on the eastern edge of Diogenes' now twice claimed Arabia Felix, meddling by other Greek allies such as Rhodes and Pergamon in Arabia Magna, an intransigent non-Hellenic population in Armenia, and perceived threats hanging in the air from the Scythians to the north, the Parthians to the east, and the Romans to the west, all of these factions now becoming large, powerful, and militarily advanced. However, a threat perhaps just as great has taken root within the faction, Antiochos Theos casting aside his wife in favor of a new woman, an act that threatens political stability and royal succession.